We'll go ahead and get our event underway now, since we gave a couple more minutes for everyone to arrive from class and from out of town. What I'd like to begin with is just a brief introduction from our History Club president, Cameron. And Cameron, please just go ahead and say hello to everybody.
Hey guys, I'm Cameron, the History Club president. I just want to really welcome you guys to this talk. We're very excited to be able to help put this together. A lot of our officers worked extremely hard to run this event, so thank you so much for showing up. And I hope you guys enjoy the talk. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Cameron. Okay, so I also am going to offer a more formal introduction to our speaker today, who is seated before us here at the front. I'll try to keep this rather brief, but I'd like to start by welcoming all of you to this invited lecture hosted by Washington State University History Department and the History Club. I'd like to thank Dr. Sutton for his support of the club and its new lecture series, welcoming now its fourth speaker, which is very exciting. I'd also like to thank the club's student officers and our student volunteers for their help in organizing and advertising this talk across campus. Your hard work does not go unnoticed, so again, thank you. Further, I'd like to thank Claudia Micas, our department program coordinator, for all her assistance in getting various aspects and important tasks completed that really helped make this event possible. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you in attendance from WSU, UI, Gonzaga, for all helping us welcome our speaker, Dr. Erich Gruen, to WSU to share his current research on Gaius Julius Caesar and his wars. So before I formally introduce Erich, I did want to mention that the History Club is hosting a post-talk informal meet and greet for faculty, graduate students, and select undergraduates, particularly club members. If you're interested in becoming a History Club member, please do see Cameron after the talk, and she will get you on our mailer. This will be hosted in Q518, so just a couple of blocks over, not very far, informally from roughly 6-ish to 7-ish. As far as it's a great way to say hello, get to know Dr. Gruen on a personal level, and then also we have pizza and drinks, so you can come get a snack, all right? Okay, so where does one start when introducing someone who has built such a monumental career, if I can do so without embarrassing him too much? I freely admit that this visit by Erich is personally very exciting. I met Erich 5 years ago in Washington, D.C., where I had the great pleasure of sharing a panel with him that was presenting research in honor of one of his former students and one of my mentors. I'll never forget the grace, friendliness, and support that he showed this young scholar in that moment. I met someone who I greatly respected, and even though he certainly didn't have to, he treated me with dignity as being, at least for the day, one of his peers. I must say that this has not been my experience with all well-placed and well-published scholars, and it speaks directly to who Erich is as a scholar, a teacher, and most importantly, a person. Not only is Erich a leading expert in the study of ancient Greek and Roman history, but his extensive work and the influence of that work has been hugely valuable to my growth as a graduate student and then a scholar. Erich has published 9 scholarly books during his long and illustrious career, with his most recent work, Scriptural Tales Retold, The Inventiveness of Second Temple Jews, having been published just this year, so congratulations on that. He also is the author of dozens of articles and book chapters over his 60-year academic career. Although enjoying aspects of retirement over the past several years, Erich serves as the Wood Professor Emeritus at the University of Berkeley, and he remains intrinsically involved in the teaching and mentoring of the emerging generation of young ancient historians and classicists. Indeed, if you ask him, more so than all his publications and accolades, Erich is most proud of his service on the dissertation committees of 104 PhD students. In fact, my work and career are a product of 2 of these advisees, Dr. Art Eckstein, who taught at the University of Maryland, where I earned my MA, and Dr. Steve Ross, who still teaches at Louisiana State University, where I earned my PhD. In this, Erich is, of sorts, my academic grandpa. So thank you for that. And in true Hellenistic royal fashion, where genealogy was quite often bizarre, as some of you are aware, he's actually my double grandpa. So all kidding aside, I have been working with Erich for the past 5 years to get him here to WSU to share some of his thoughts with our students and faculty. And I'm so glad to see that the day has finally come. So yes, of course, welcome, With all that said, would you please again help welcome Dr. Erich Gruen for his lecture, The Legitimacy and Legitimization of Caesar's Wars.
Can I be heard in the back?
In the back, we're good?
Great, thank you.
All right, and I'll stick that there, or if you want to hold it, or whatever.
Yeah, I don't want to choke on it right now. At least not right away. Thank you so much, Nick. I'm so pleased to be here. So I thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the History Club for supporting this, and for the History Department for being a sponsor of this event. And it's I'm particularly pleased with this very kind introduction. You know, as I've often said, when I'm invited to give a lecture somewhere, I always worry about it a bit. I want to be sure that I don't make too many blunders, and that I can be understood without being mocked. There's always a certain amount of nerves involved prior to giving a lecture. But what makes it all worthwhile is hearing the introduction. So thank you again for that, Nick, and thank you all for being here. This is a marvelous audience. I rarely speak before numbers of this kind, and I may never again, for all I know. Well, let's begin. Julius Caesar strides like a colossus over the annals of Roman history. There's no figure who's more familiar, more discussed, more debated, more scrutinized. There's no student of Latin who can escape him, because nobody with even the slightest acquaintance with Rome is unfamiliar with him, or at least the image that he's cast. And that image rests in large part on his accomplishments as a warrior and the legacy left by those accomplishments. Two major wars, central and profoundly pivotal to the history of Rome, are forever associated with Caesar. The Gallic War, that produced by far the largest territorial expansion of the Roman Empire to that date, and the Civil War between Caesar and Pompey, which left the Roman Republic in ruins and generated the inception of autocracy. Now, I can't, of course, address here in any detail those momentous events, the causes and the consequences of those events. Too many volumes have already been devoted to them, and I'm guilty of contributing to that excessive number of volumes. But what I want to do today is to ask how those wars were justified, how Caesar himself in his own writings explained the reasons for those wars, and how this reflects, even more importantly, upon the Romans' own sense of what counts as legitimacy for the taking up of arms. And that is not an irrelevant matter in our own day. Now, Julius Caesar fought in Gaul for 9 years. And at the conclusion of those campaigns, the whole of the land, roughly modern France, from the Rhine to the Pyrenees, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, had now fallen under Roman sway. It was an immense extension of Roman imperial holdings, unlike anything achieved before that. And by contrast with the spread of Roman power and influence in the East, which had proceeded in intermittent and unsystematic steps over a period of a century and a half, unlike that, the conquest of Gaul came with remarkable swiftness under the direction of a single commander. It was a stunning achievement and an enduring achievement. The attachment of this vast territory to the sphere of Roman control was a feat of immense magnitude. Now, in retrospect, it's tempting to imagine a master plan framed from the start and pursued consistently throughout by a determined general whose drive to broaden Roman frontiers and to promote his own self-aggrandizement went hand in hand. As the Roman historian Sallust wrote a few years after Caesar's death, he said, Caesar was aiming for a great command, an army, a new war where his virtue could shine forth. So it all seems inevitable and obvious. But if we transport ourselves back to the year 59 BCE, the year of Caesar's consulship, when he was awarded this provincial command that took him to Gaul, at that time there could hardly have been any inevitability or even expectation about the outcome. Because Caesar had only a modest military reputation at that time. Certainly nothing to compare with the stature of his ally and friend, Pompey the Great. That Caesar expected a command, a military command after his consulship in order to add laurels to his political prestige, that doesn't cause any surprise. But nothing suggests that the addition of the whole of Gaul to Rome's imperial holdings was part of Caesar's scheme, let alone that it was the design of the Roman Senate from the start. In 59, the Popular Assembly in Rome, the body that passed legislation, passed a law that awarded to Caesar a 5-year command in imperium over the provinces of Cisalpine Gaul, which is essentially northern Italy, south of the Alps, and Illyricum, which is currently, roughly at least, the nation of Croatia. Now, both those provinces had for many years been an uncontested part of the Roman Empire. Now, Caesar might well have expected some minor fighting and the possibility of gaining a triumph in Illyricum, but certainly not in Cisalpine Gaul. Gaul, this side, the Italian side of the Alps, because that had long been pacified. Insofar as there might have been a potential launching pad for expansionism, it would have had to be the province of Transalpine Gaul, Gaul across the Alps. But even that first of all, was not included in Caesar's package when he was awarded this command. This is the Transalpine Gaul, is roughly, now for those of you who may know it, Provence in France. Provence got its name from the Latin provincia, the province, the Roman province. But this was not part of Caesar's command at the outset. And that area had been converted into a Roman province 60 years earlier. And the Romans had shown little or no interest in expanding beyond it during that whole period. Now, as it happens, the province of Transalpine Gaul, Gallia Transalpina, had been assigned to a certain Quintus Metellus Celer, who was consul in the year 60. And it was only when Celer died unexpectedly that Gallia Transalpina was added by the Senate to Caesar's charge, and at a time when matters had already settled down in that province and had been for some time with short breaks. In other words, there was no obvious prospect for a major push into the vast stretches of Gaul when Caesar took up the command in 58. And neither the Senate nor the people of Rome had given any explicit authorization for such a push. And yet, as it turned out, Transalpine Gaul became the launching pad for the general's sweeping and unprecedented extension of empire. Now, how had that happened? I'll take a drink here, not just because I'm thirsty, but to add some suspense to this whole question. Now, on the face of it, an aggressive and unprovoked move by a Roman general beyond the borders of his assigned province was in principle an act of war, and it was inconsistent with Roman values and principles. Indeed, it was inconsistent or in violation of Roman law. Now, long-standing tradition had it that Rome did not initiate conflict unless the cause was proper and justified, the bellum justum, the righteous war. And in theory, this tradition went back to the almost to the beginnings of Roman history. And there was an elaborate procedure that governed the preliminaries of any hostile action against another nation, a prescribed formula with religious overtones, and the gods looking on. And according to that formula, Romans would present their grievances to a hostile nation. We'd request restitution and reparations, and if refused, with the gods as their witness, this would provide grounds for a just war, the bellum justum. Now, whether this form of ceremony was actually practiced with any regularity is disputed in the scholarship, but that does not alter the principle of the bellum justum, the fact that it was espoused by the Romans as part of their self-image, that they fought only just wars. And the classic formulation of this principle appears in the work of the great orator Cicero, who was a contemporary of Caesar, and he asserts in his De Republica on the state that there can be no just war without the proper formulas asking for reparations, and that the Roman people, he says, have gained authority over all lands only by coming to the defense of their allies. And later in another work of Cicero's, the De Officiis on duties, he reaffirms here that there can be no bellum justum without those proper preliminaries as prescribed by law in the most solemn of ceremonies. And that Rome, he says, waged wars and exercised power only to defend provinces and allies with justice and loyalty. Well, those were noble sentiments, to be sure. And the Romans did, in fact, follow these procedures, or at least paid lip service to them, on several occasions in the course of building up the Roman Empire through justifiable military action. Moreover, the Roman assembly confirmed this practice, this tradition, by passing a law in the time of Sulla, which is a couple of decades before Caesar, and it was then reinstituted by Caesar himself in his consulship in 59, a law that prohibited any Roman governor of a province from leading an army outside the borders of the province and waging war on his own accord without gaining the authorization of the Senate and people of Rome. Now, all that seems quite straightforward and clear, both as moral principle and as statutory law. And yet Caesar's actions in Gaul, when closely examined, seem to be operating on an altogether different level of understanding. Were his actions legitimate? And an equally, if not more, interesting question, how did Caesar himself seek to legitimize them? Because we're fortunate in having Caesar's own account, his commentaries, the De Bello Gallico on the Gallic War, composed, as it seems, serially, year by year, during his campaign, and eventually published as a whole. Usually it's the first text that's read by young students early in the study of Latin. Now, how did Caesar present his entrance into this conflict? And how did he justify it? And the answer may seem surprising. Word reached Caesar in his province of Transalpine Gaul in the late winter of 58. Word reached him that the Gallic tribe of the Helvetii, who were located in the area around Lake Geneva, that they had determined to abandon their homes and their villages and to move westward, probably because of the pressure of German tribes coming across the Rhine into their territory. Now, the most convenient route for this migration of the Helvetii would lead them to cross the Roman province. And that was a prospect that Caesar could not tolerate. So the Helvetii, who knew this, took a different route. They skirted the Roman province, and they entered territory in which they clashed with other Gallic tribes. But from Caesar's vantage point, they were too close for comfort. And they were wreaking havoc upon Gallic peoples who were allied with Rome. It was this incursion that induced the imperator, Caesar, the general, to mobilize his forces, move outside the province, and clash openly with the Helvetii. And thus began the long series of Gallic wars that lasted almost a decade. Now, up to this point, Caesar's actions were perfectly reasonable. The governor of any Roman province would be expected to protect its borders, but crossing those borders himself and going outside his province, that required more justification. Now, Caesar had some ostensible grounds for it. Assaults on Roman allies beyond the frontiers could, in principle, provide appropriate legitimation. That is, the claim that the aggressors might, by defeating Roman allies, might also menace the stability of the province itself. And Caesar, in fact, points to delegations to him and requests for assistance from Gallic tribes, notably the Aedui, just beyond the border of his province, and the Allobroges, who were actually within the province. Now that could provide reason, perfectly justifiable reason, for moving forces across the provincial frontier. But Caesar's initial penetration across the borders of his province, however defensible that might have been, it was only the start. It was after defeating the Helvetii, Caesar heeded the call of the Aedui and the Treveri, other Gallic tribes, to halt the advance of Germanic tribes under Ariovistus, who threatened the sovereignty of Gallic peoples. And that was enough to motivate Caesar for hostilities against Ariovistus, culminating in a decisive Roman victory over the Germans in the Battle of Vesontio. Now that dramatic development was surely not part of a preconceived grand scheme on Caesar's part. Caesar could hardly have planned that in advance, because the year before, during his consulship of 59, Caesar had actually been instrumental in having Ariovistus officially listed by the Roman Senate as a friend, as a king who was a friend of Rome. Now, the crucial point here is that the victories in 58 over the Helvetii and over Ariovistus and his German troops that triggered the eventual conquest of the whole of Gaul, all this took place outside the province of Gallia Transalpina, and thus technically beyond the jurisdiction of the Roman governor. So were these actions then illegitimate? Was this wanton aggression by Caesar to inaugurate Roman imperial expansion in Gaul? Well, that's an especially troublesome question, because Caesar himself, as I mentioned, had sponsored a measure when he was consul in 59 that prohibited provincial governors from leaving their provinces and leading an army beyond their borders and waging war on their own initiative. So did Caesar violate his own law in the very next year without being held to account for it? If so, this is particularly striking. And what I want to emphasize is that he did not hesitate to record the very fact of his militant movements outside the province, didn't hesitate to include them in his own commentaries. Yes, he could provide a perfectly reasonable rationale in line both with tradition and with law, if he wanted to. In principle, Caesar could certainly make a case for his actions on the grounds of securing the boundaries of the province, coming to the aid of allies in the vicinity who were under attack. And he did, in fact, maintain that he went to war with the Helvetii because of their march westwards, even though they did avoid the Roman province. He could have said, nevertheless, they brought potential danger to it. And he certainly made comparable claims to account for his war on Ariovistus and the Germans, because they had crossed the Rhine, he said, to plunder the wealth of the Gauls and to occupy their territory. And if they were allowed to go unchecked, they might absorb the whole of Gaul. And like the earlier Germanic invasions, couple of 4 decades before, they would have a springboard for the invasion of Italy. In other words, this would have been an argument for preventive warfare. Hit them before they hit you. And one would expect the author of the De Bello Gallico to frame his rationale in order to account for conducting warfare outside the province as the need for resisting enemies who threatened Rome's allies. Thus, it would be a bellum justum, a righteous war. What is surprising, however, is that Caesar made so little use of that form of legitimization. It hardly appears in his narrative, and he never employs the term bellum justum. In his own account, Caesar said, he moved his troops beyond the frontiers of his province in the spring of 58 in mobilization against the Helvetii, period. Full stop. That's all he says. He feels no need to conceal the event, and he presents it without any explanation. As he put it in his own matter-of-fact style, and this is handout number 1, Caesar led his army from the territory of the Allobroges to that of the Segusiavi, the first people beyond the province, across the Rhone. Caesar evidently did not feel that it required legitimization. At least he offered none. Nor does he give any hint of a bad conscience on this score. After conclusion of the first campaigning season, with the Helvetii defeated and the Germans driven back across the Rhine, one might have anticipated that Caesar would then bring his forces back within the borders of his province of Gallia Transalpina. What he did instead was to send his army into winter quarters in the very heart of the territory of the Gallic tribe of the Sequani in central Gaul, well beyond the frontiers of the Roman province. And that act signaled an intention to expand Roman influence, to extend Roman hegemony. The Gauls could hardly draw any other conclusion from that. And Caesar once again records this. And he records it without comment, let alone any effort at legitimation. And not surprisingly, it triggered uprisings among Gauls in the following year, the repercussions of which would eventually issue in the total conquest of Gaul. Now, we needn't believe, and we shouldn't believe, that Caesar had such a long-range plan, the conquest of all of Gaul, back in 58 or 57. But what I want to emphasize here is that he did not bother to offer explanation. He made no claim, for instance, that the Sequani had asked for protection or that a German invasion was imminent and he had to block it. Caesar reports, and this is number 2 in your handout, Caesar reports only that he took his army into winter quarters in the land of the Sequani, as if this were an obvious, logical, and unobjectionable thing to do. So Caesar engaged neither in apologia nor in deception in order to conjure up legitimacy for his advance. Rome's cause was his cause. He makes that point unabashedly more than once. In one noteworthy passage, this is number 3 on your handout, Caesar reports that in his view, the fact that the Aedui, who were often referred by the Roman Senate as Rome's brothers and kinsmen among the Gauls, the Aedui had been enslaved by the Germans. The fact that they had been enslaved by the Germans, he says, was utterly disgraceful for himself and for the Republic. He puts himself first. There's no false modesty here, and no need for any modesty. Nothing to be modest about in his view. Now, to be sure, Caesar's political enemies in Rome, led by Cato the Younger, would attack him in the Senate for atrocities committed in this war. And he did commit atrocities. Afterward, for example, after word came of Caesar's treacherous assault upon Germans during a truce in 55, Cato even suggested that Caesar should be surrendered to the Germans in order to appease the gods for such violation of oaths and pledges. But Caesar is unapologetic for his own violation of the truce, and he even proclaims that when German women and children fled in panic, he sent his cavalry to hunt them down. That is number 4 on your handout. No effort to apologize, no effort to legitimize. And it's particularly revealing that the criticism of Caesar, even that fiercest enemy, Cato, did not express any reservations about his having brought troops outside the borders of his province, or having conducted offensive and preemptive warfare, or having added relentlessly to the territorial holdings of the Roman Empire. On the contrary, those very actions had earned Caesar the senatorial vote of a 15-day thanksgiving to the gods on Caesar's behalf, an action that had never previously been accorded to any man. Now, none of this means that legitimacy or legitimization was altogether irrelevant. But the fact that the allusions to it in the De Bello Gallico are rare, muted, and minimal is quite striking, for it indicates that Caesar felt no urgency, no obligation about presenting a justification. Now, why is that? Well, he knew, I believe, that Romans did not usually argue with success on the battlefield. Yes, laws existed to restrain commanders from exceeding their assigned responsibilities or engaging in misconduct that could bring discredit upon the Republic. But enforcement of those general principles was inconsistent, erratic, and dependent upon circumstances. What this episode implies is that Caesar could count on the fact that his victories would drown out most objections. His successes on the battlefield were such that he could dispense with strained claims on legitimacy. His own narrative in the De Bello Gallico freely spoke of Caesar's ignoring provincial boundaries, conducting aggressive warfare, extending imperial holdings, violating truces, and even cutting down women and children. He did not even resort to, in defending his actions, he didn't resort to alleging the wickedness of the Gauls. Didn't bother even with that. That was unnecessary. With the certainty that he had, that his actions were in the interests of the nation, Caesar, in his writings, had no need to suppress facts, let alone apologize for them. And the relative absence of any expressed legitimation for the war in Gaul, surprising though that may be, it makes a telling point. Caesar's treatise, the De Bello Gallico, was composed to proclaim achievements, not to rationalize them. That was the Roman way. Now, for the Romans, foreign wars, like the war in Gaul, didn't require a lot of soul searching. Civil war, on the other hand, was a very different matter. I want to turn now to that. The opening chapters of Caesar's other treatise, the Bellum Civile, Civil War, referring to the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, which followed upon the Gallic Wars. These lines possess a very different character, quite distinct from the De Bello Gallico. At least at first sight they do. Because armed conflict between Romans and Romans did demand some justification, especially from a proconsul like Caesar, who marched a Roman army across provincial borders into Italy itself, thus inaugurating a war against his fellow citizens. What constituted legitimacy here was much more problematic. And the need for some kind of legitimation was inescapable. Caesar crossed the Rubicon, that small stream that officially separated his province of Cisalpine Gaul from Italy, crossed the Rubicon on the 10th or 11th of January of 49 BCE. That dramatic move was the opening event that triggered the momentous war between Caesar and Pompey that would eventually lead to the fall of the Roman Republic. Now, later sources made much of that event, the crossing of the Rubicon, in order to underscore the drama, to heighten the intensity of the moment, and the die was cast. Forever since then, of course, become a cliche for the no turning back. You'll find that the die is cast, or something like it, in authors like Plutarch and Suetonius and Appian. But by contrast, Caesar's own account makes no mention of that pivotal moment. Glaring omission. Because to refer to an act that could be seen as inaugurating rebellion against the state, that would require some serious legitimation. Caesar evidently wished to avoid that unwelcome task, simply refrained from even mentioning the occasion of the crossing of the Rubicon. For him, defending his actions would be uncomfortable, and in his view, largely irrelevant. Now, did Caesar in fact shatter legal and constitutional norms by marching on Italy? Or did his enemies provoke the conflict by violating conventional expectations and depriving Caesar of appropriately earned offices and honors as he claimed? The question of who was in the right here has gripped readers for centuries. I'm not going to plunge into that thorny thicket. I wrote about it long ago, and I don't want to repeat it now. But what I do want to do is to address the question of legitimacy, and particularly how was it framed by Caesar. Now, to approach the question of legitimacy or legitimization, let's look first at the salient facts as we know them that led to this climax. They're very complicated, but I'll try to be brief and to touch just on the most central issues. Caesar's command in Gaul had come under a law, as I indicated before, come under a law passed by the Assembly in 59, and it was to last for 5 years. And when the end of those 5 years was approaching, another law, this one prompted by Pompey and Crassus, Caesar's allies, in their consulship of 55. That law renewed Caesar's commission for another 5 years. Now, just what terminal date that measure contained has produced endless discussions among scholars. I'm not going to get into that hornet's nest, but I point out that Caesar's enemies actually proposed that he be replaced on several different occasions from 51 to 49. And the fact that they nowhere cited a clause in the law that specified a terminal date suggests that the measure did not contain such a date. And that gave ample scope for political wrangling. Repeated proposals arose in the Senate towards the end of those 10 years that Caesar should be recalled, that his provinces should be reassigned to somebody else. Caesar, even late in the year 50, chose to stay in Gaul rather than to return home, even though fighting in Gaul had ceased sometime earlier. And his senatorial foes, on the other hand, preferred to put an end to his imperium, to appoint one of their own, specifically Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, to take charge of the Gallic provinces. And the legitimacy of that endeavor had been complicated already in the year 52, when the 10 tribunes of that year, there are 10 that were elected every year as supposedly spokespersons for the people, 10 tribunes of that year unanimously sponsored a bill to allow Caesar to offer his candidacy for a second consulship in absentia, that is, while he was still in Gaul. Now, that waived the normal requirement that a candidate for election should present himself in person. Now, in Caesar's interpretation of this measure in his De Bello Gallico, the law of the tribunes, of the 10 tribunes, gave him the right, at least implicitly, to remain in Gaul through the consular elections of the year 49, so that when senatorial foes pressed for his return in 51 and in 50, he described this effort as premature, even as violating the law that had extended his command for 5 years in 55. His opponents did not see it that way. They claimed already in 51 that the task of subduing the Gauls was complete. Caesar should be replaced. The effort to replace him was repeated in various forms and on several occasions in the next year and a half, with opinions in the Senate sharply divided, but without any tangible effect. Caesar's partisans managed to postpone action for many months. And Pompey, still Caesar's ally at this point, offered a compromise proposal that called for discussion of the Gallic provinces and who was to govern them to take place after March of the year 50. Seemed a reasonable compromise on the face of it. The debates on these matters, the fact that there were debates on these matters, clearly reflect ad hoc maneuvers, not technical or legal arguments. Well, March of 50 came and went without any decision. Tensions then began to rise. Enemies of Caesar put increasing pressure on Pompey to break with his political partner. Now, Pompey had hoped to evade that break and offered yet another proposal, suggested that Caesar should have yet another half year in Gaul if he wanted, this time until November of 50. Again, an ad hoc suggestion, not a constitutional pronouncement or a legal challenge. The issue of legitimacy seemed to be an afterthought at best. But by the late summer of 50, some people considered civil war, which had previously been unthinkable, to be a real possibility. And after November of 50, no further postponement of the decision would be tolerated. But the tribune, or one of the tribunes, Curio, proposed an attractive escape from the brink of calamity in December of 50. He put a motion to the Senate that both Caesar and Pompey should discharge their armies. And that motion passed in the Senate overwhelmingly by a vote of 370 to 22, which gave a pretty clear signal of what senatorial opinion was. Unfortunately, the political stakes for Caesar's enemies, who had now drawn Pompey into their ranks, stakes had become too high for them to back down, and matters would soon come to a head. Now, Caesar, to his credit, made various efforts through agents or spokesmen to engage in negotiation and to head off conflict. In December of 50, he offered a number of compromises. But those who were pressing for a showdown would not be deterred. The enemies of Caesar fixed yet another date by which he had to disband his army. And they overbore the objections of the tribunes, Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius. They ignored their vetoes. They short-circuited efforts to continue negotiations. And most dramatically, they engineered a vote for the emergency decree of the Senate, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, which authorized all magistrates to take whatever steps are needed to preserve the safety of the Republic. This, of course, was directed against Caesar. Pompey now declared himself ready to mobilize his forces. New provincial assignments were declared, and among them, of course, the official award of Gaul as a province to Domitius Ahenobarbus, thus to replace Caesar. Now, all of this transpired in the first week of January of 49. Consuls left the city. Tribunes whose vetoes were discounted fled to Caesar's camp. And Caesar, shortly after, crossed the Rubicon. In this rapid-fire sequence of events, Caesar's moved with his army without hesitation to the borders of Italy, and the unbending belligerence of anti-Caesarian elements in the Senate, who had won Pompey to their side, this erased any hope for reconciliation. Now, in all of this, it has to be stressed, legalities took a back seat on both sides. Ad hoc maneuverings dominated the events. For example, whatever the law that extended Caesar's command for 5 years in 55 may have said, the Senate had decided to fix its own terminal date in January of 49. And despite laws on the books, including one of Caesar's own, that prohibited provincial governors from overstepping the bounds of their province, Caesar had not only done this in Gaul, but he now did it again by crossing the Rubicon into Italy. So legitimacy seems to have been overshadowed or sidelined at every step of the way, not a factor of relevance in the deliberations. But what about legitimation after the fact? That's the more interesting question. Caesar naturally felt obliged to offer some explanations. And unsurprisingly, one finds them in the opening chapters of his Bellum Civile. But what does cause surprise, and is rarely noted, is that legal or constitutional rationalization which plays so large a part in modern debates on this subject as to who was right and who was wrong, it plays so small a role in Caesar's own account. Now, the Imperator Caesar does, to be sure, make reference to actions taken by his foes in Rome that, in his view, violated precedents and gave grounds for his march on Italy. He protests that the most basic prerogative of tribunes, the exercise of their veto, was overridden, that the Senate chose to direct the SCU against him, whereas it had only been used in the past, in the direst of emergencies. He claimed that consuls abandoned the city, leaving private citizens with emblems of authority, and that he, Caesar, had been prematurely recalled from his post in Gaul, despite a law of the people allowing him to stay, so he claimed, until the elections for the following year. Now, all of this he did say in the Bellum Civile. But this list of grievances, some of which are tendentious, certainly, or exaggerated, did not represent the core of his complaint. Caesar's argument was less a constitutional one or a legal one than a personal one. The complaints about formal violations pale by comparison with Caesar's personal and political attacks on the senatorial leaders who, in his opinion, had driven him to engage in civil conflict. In his account, the consul of 49, Lentulus, and his ally, Metellus Scipio, had browbeaten and bullied the Senate into taking action against him, even intimidating and silencing those who offered more moderate proposals. Now, as Caesar presents it, all the friends of the consuls and the supporters of Pompey were dragooned into attending the Senate, and by their presence, they terrified the waverers and deprived the majority of the ability to speak freely. He ascribes Cato's opposition to his personal enmity and to his disappointment at having a political defeat. He saw Lentulus's hostility as driven by his heavy debts and by the hope of recouping losses through a military command. And he portrays Metellus Scipio's motives as aspirations for a provincial governorship for himself and fear of prosecution. And as for Pompey's estrangement from him, he ascribes that to pressure by Caesar's enemies and to Pompey's own egotistical reluctance to have anyone placed on a level of eminence equal to him. Caesar. So when Caesar reached Rome, he limits his self-defense simply to a recounting of the injuries done to him by his personal enemies. Now, of course, Caesar depicts his own posture as one of sweet reasonableness. He had sought no extraordinary office, he says. He had observed the proper interval between consulships, 10 years. He had proposed compromises, whereas his foes, in seeking to snatch his legions from him, had acted with insolence, ferocity, and cruelty. All he wanted to do, he says, was to surpass others in justice and equity. Now, the tendentiousness of all this is quite plain. We have a letter of Cicero exactly contemporary to the events that Caesar recorded here, and it presents an altogether different picture. It describes Caesar's missives to the Senate as harsh and menacing, and his insistence on maintaining his army and province as shameless. Now, that there were differences, sharp differences of opinion on these matters is plain. Cicero correctly describes the bafflement that must have prevailed everywhere. How could this possibly be happening? Now, it's not my purpose to determine which side had a better claim on legitimacy. That's what modern scholars obsess about. Rather, I want to question how far legitimacy in law, tradition, or principle was an issue at all. And even more pointedly, how far Caesar felt the need to provide any legitimation. In my view, it was not in any way a major concern. Caesar seems to have agonized very little over formal legitimacy. He makes no allusion to a bellum justum. In his treatise on the Civil War, he declared his principal interest unabashedly. It was the defense of his own dignitas. That's handout number 5. That was central. Now, the term dignitas crops up more than once in Caesar's works with regard to himself. I have other passages there in handouts 6 through 8 to illustrate that. Now, the Latin word dignitas has no direct English equivalent. It combines something like esteem, stature, and personal accomplishment. And those were matters of very high importance to any Roman aristocrat. Caesar's stress on dignitas was critical to his own self-perception and equally important to the image that he presented in his works. Now, there's a fascinating passage in the Bellum Civile, the Civil War that Caesar wrote, which hasn't received the attention that it should, in my view, but it's quite revealing here. The words, this is handout number 9, the words are put by Caesar in his writings into the mouth of a representative of Pompey, who expressed them as Pompey's own sentiments. And he stated that Caesar, in view of his dignitas, should dismiss any partisan zeal or anger towards his opponents in the interests of the Republic. Now, by having Pompey himself refer to Caesar's dignitas and to acknowledge it, Caesar, in effect, implicated Pompey in Caesar's own posture and his own presentation. This was really a remarkable tour de force by Caesar, the author. So Caesar, in short, did not need recourse to apologia, to statutory or legal authorization, or to juridical justification. In fact, and I would stress this point, if he were to do so, it would suggest that his enemies had some plausible case against him that he needed to contest. Instead, so he implied, he rested his case on his own achievement and his preeminence. And that sufficed to outweigh any criticism. Now, what conclusion should we draw from this discussion? It's not that Caesar stood apart from all others, unique in his arrogance, dismissive of Roman precedent, violation of Roman tradition. I would say, on the contrary, he actually appealed to a rather important strain in Roman precedent and tradition, and that others in his situation and with his range of accomplishment would have done no differently. He represented an exemplar of the respect and awe generated by an esteemed military and civic leader who brought victory over the enemy and civic benefits to the Republic. He had the aura of success that signified the favor of the gods, an aura that would be cheapened if he dwelled on the justification or self-defense. It was preferable to have his deeds speak for themselves. And for most Romans, that did not mean dispensing with legitimacy. It was legitimacy. Thank you very much.
What we'll do now is we will have roughly about 20 minutes of Q&A time. We do, of course, welcome faculty and students to get involved in that. So students, please do stay and pay attention to the Q&A. And if you would like to ask a question, this is a great venue for that. I will go ahead and open up the forum for questions for Dr. Gruen. I do apologize for not having a mic, so please do project your questions so that we can hear it. I'll try to respond or reply to a question or echo it if it is not quite heard by everyone. So please, any questions?
Got one over here.
Yes, hey, please.
Why was his 6-month like a placement in Gaul? Why was it extended for 6 months with Pompey? Why did he call for 6 months?
It was actually extended for 5 years. He had the initial command for 5 years, starting in his proconsulship of 58, and then it was extended in 55 to 5 more years. Are you asking why this happened? For whose benefit and on whose account? Well, after the first 4 or 5 years in Gaul, Caesar had accomplished an enormous amount. He had conquered a great deal of territory, defeated a good number of Gallic tribes. But the job, in his view at least, was nowhere near finished. He wanted to extend it through the whole of Gaul so that all of the Gallic tribes would be now under the umbrella of Roman protection or imperial authority. He needed more time. And Pompey and Crassus, who were there were 2 consuls in every year in Rome. Pompey and Crassus were the consuls in 55, were allies of Caesar. And up until that time, Caesar's successes in Gaul had been celebrated in the Roman Senate. So this was an opportunity for Pompey and Crassus, and they took that opportunity to have that command extended for another 5 years. And this was voted, we don't know the numbers, but pretty overwhelmingly by the people of Rome. So at this point, and this already is indicative of the image that Caesar was projecting and the authority he had in Rome, that his image had in Rome, that he was already, everybody was, okay, these are all successes. We need to celebrate them, not terminate them.
Please, other questions? Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you for a great talk. It made me think of that famous quip from Plutarch's Life of Pompey, right? Like, stop quoting the laws to us, we carry swords. That whole idea of we don't need to any kind of legal legitimacy. We have this military potential behind us, and of course, Plutarch's text is much later. But I wonder, like, that kind of interesting echo, especially towards the end of your talk, you mentioned that, like, in some ways, you think that lack of need to legitimize, or rather, legitimizing kind of after the fact and or like, in the process of doing something, rather than trying to think of excuses for it, represents a kind of broader consensus or cultural sort of consensus, at least in part of Roman culture. Yeah, I was wondering if you could kind of comment on that. Like, do you think that's sort of kind of what Plutarch was also echoing in some ways?
Yes, I think he was. And as I tried to indicate, what Caesar was doing here was not a break with tradition. It was a re-emphasizing in an even stronger fashion the tradition that the military commander who was successful. Military commanders who were not successful didn't do as well on the political front at home. But the successful commander, even though, and there have been many instances in the Roman past in which they were criticized. They had enemies, they had political rivals in the Senate who were carping at them and claiming this, they only did this because of the loot, which he could then bring home for himself, his family, and his friends. But that the issue of the actual legitimacy of the war was rarely a matter of controversy. Despite the fact that we had the law in the books, at least from Sulla on, and the repeated sense of the tradition. This is not what Romans do. They don't fight these unjust wars. They're always legitimate. That was still there. It had been there in the past, and it overrode, in many cases, claims to the contrary. So that Caesar was not breaking new ground here. He was more successful than most. You didn't have any previous general who conquered the territory equivalent to Gaul. So he was more successful than most, but in terms of parading those achievements, this was standard Roman practice, and the acknowledgement of those achievements of the populace by the commander was also traditional, and no one, I think, raised an objection to it on those grounds.
So if Roman law, or if all Roman wars are just wars, because Rome only fights just wars, then if there is a war, then it's just. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it becomes this, like...
In a way, that's true. That is true. Though they did have to go through, at least in theory, they went through the formalities of asking for reparations.
It already happened, and, too late for the formalities.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions?
Could you elaborate more on Legitimacy and where that ideology stems from?
The ideology of success?
Of dignitas.
Like, where does he where does he inherit, like, those ideas from? Really?
Yes, fine. Which particular ideas are you referring to?
Of the word dignitas.
Of the word dignitas? Well, so far as we know, this was always part of a Roman aristocrat's emblematic claims, that his dignitas, which, as I said, there's no direct English equivalent of it, but mostly when we write about it, we use the Latin term so as to not get ourselves into trouble. But it basically suggests the achievements of a Roman aristocrat, the esteem that he had earned, and the gains that he had made for Rome, not just for himself, but for Rome. And that represented his own dignitas. And this was we don't have the kind of evidence for earlier Republic and Middle Republican period that we do for the late Republic, where we have Caesar's own commentaries, and we also have Cicero's letters and speeches that provide a much fuller understanding of what was going on. But there is no reason to doubt that this emphasis on the aristocrat's dignitas, which could not be gainsaid in any way, goes back to the early Republic and to the Middle Republic as well. So Caesar was not, as I said, not breaking new ground here. He shouldn't be seen as, he often is seen as somebody who was unique in this. He was perhaps uniquely successful in many ways, but not in his claims and not in his image of himself, which was standard Roman aristocratic image. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, Caleb.
I know you mentioned it, but how big of an impact do you think Caesar's atrocities he committed in Gaul had on the view the Roman people had of his war, or did his success significantly downplay how much they cared?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because that is a disturbing feature of this whole story. That not only did he engage in these atrocities, but what struck me most is that he wrote about them himself. He didn't disguise them, he didn't dismiss them, he didn't deny them. The most striking passage there is with regard to his hunting down women and children against the Germans, among the Germans. And some people have said, well, or some have suggested that Germans were a case apart, that they were so barbarous, so savage, so hostile to the Romans, that anything goes. And so Caesar didn't have to explain, justify, or legitimize it. But I don't think that really answers this very troubling question. Because these Germans, at least some of them, some of their leaders, were allegedly friends and allies of Rome, officially friends and allies, were voted as such by the Roman Senate. So they were not all regarded as barbarous, not all regarded as hopeless savages. And this is true also of the Gauls. The interesting thing is Caesar did not anywhere try to justify the war by demonizing the Gauls. He could have done, perhaps, but he didn't, and that's itself very interesting. In fact, insofar as he talks about the Gauls as a people, and their attitudes, their values, their principles, he praises them. He praises the Gauls for their resilience, their resistance to Rome, the fact, and he puts it this way quite boldly, they fought on behalf of their own liberty and freedom, and that this was admirable, even though, of course, we have to defeat them, we have to kill them for Rome's sake, but this is not because the Gauls were evil, wicked, or inferior human beings. And in a way, of course, one can say that the greater stature you give to your enemies, the greater your own stature for defeating them. And but the fact that he does not go out and say this was legitimate, justified, appropriate, and proper because they were wicked, evil, or savagery, he does not do that.
Other question?
Thank you very much. I'm interested in the audience, because I'm thinking in particular, so that De Gallico, who you think maybe the intended audience was in contrast to visual, I'm an art historian.
Yes.
So I'm thinking of the dying Gaul, or where the Chinese versus the Gauls, where you have a depiction of a very honorable enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but the visual examples seem to me to be more for people more widely, not necessarily just the senator or something like that. So more about the
Well, thank you very much for that question. It's an excellent question. What we know, or pretty well know, is that what ended as the De Bello Gallico as a whole was actually produced year by year by Caesar and sent to the Roman Senate so as continually to remind them of his successes. We defeated them here, we defeated them there, we've gained this territory, we've gained that. So the primary audience the initial and primary order was the Roman Senate, and not everybody bought it. Caesar had his enemies, as mentioned, but certainly the principal targets of Caesar's claims here were his fellow aristocrats who were not otherwise in tune with him. And he did not, as I mentioned, did not depict the Gauls as somehow barbarous or that they needed to be civilized and brought to civilization by coercing them. Now, the visual imagery that we have of Gauls is usually quite important to distinguish them from Romans. The Gauls always have different clothing, and they are usually the defeated on the visual imagery, sometimes begging for mercy or for restitution, but they're not depicted as savages. They're not depicted as somehow subhuman. And that, I think, it's not only characteristic, but it's significant that the Romans did not want to suggest that they were defeating people who had to be defeated. And this made their conquest all the more substantial and significant. I don't know if that's answered your question, but thank you.
Probably time for just one more, and then it sounds like someone wants to come into the room. So any last questions?
Dave, please.
In framing this as a way of looking at the arguments and kind of dispensing with the arguments about legitimacy, you put this as a Caesar in a tradition, and these aren't better sources we have to hear their words, but do you think that this is a valuable way of thinking about Marius and Sulla?
We don't have their own words on this, of course. Although Sulla did write his memoirs, which we don't have, but they were picked up by later sources like Plutarch, who did read them and conveyed them, or at least in fragments. It would be very useful to have at our disposal their justifications, because they did engage in a civil war. Sulla did inaugurate a civil war against Marius and Marius's followers. It was a civil war that grew out of political rivalries there, and that was complicated and expanded because of, I don't want to go into a great detail here, but it's worth noting that this was complicated and made much more problematic because of conflict between Romans and non-Romans in Italy. This is not even, didn't involve Gauls or Germans or anybody else, but there had been a conflict between Roman citizens and Italian non-Roman citizens shortly before the clash between Marius and Sulla, and the whole issue of whether Roman citizenship should be expanded to Italians was a very hot button issue in Rome at the time. It's not the sole explanation for the conflict between them, which there are many other instances, but it puts it on a different plane. Here you have a real friction between Romans and non-Romans, but Italians who had been Roman allies through most of their history, and who now, for reasons of, again, highly complex, broke with one another and created a kind of conflict that indicated that it's not impossible for there to be a civil war between Romans and Italians, and I think that the echoes of that played into the conflict between Marius and Sulla, and in a way served as a kind of more distant background to the war between Caesar and Pompey, which was a real civil war.
All right, let's thank our speaker, Dr. Erich Gruen.